on the recent podcast, you're saying about how sort of child-unfriendly the culture had become. They're not welcoming in sort of restaurants. They say no children. I think that is one thing. I think there will be a slight move. I don't know if this is wish fulfillment on my part, but I think there will be far more social pressure towards changing those norms, towards ensuring that children are welcome in more things, as it becomes more of a crisis. And I think there may even be. I can actually see a situation where you have sort of advertising rules which show a family in a positive light because it become such a crisis. I mean, I think we're some way off that, but
Like what they've done in Hungary.
right. I mean, Hungary. If you go to Hungary, the first thing you see is there's a lot of these signs with Hungary welcomes families, and there is a picture of mum and dad and 3 children, and like the emphasis is like 3 children are normal. Everyone should have 3 children. But I mean, they've obviously got these wild tax incentives. If you have 4 children, you never have to pay income tax again. And having just done my taxes, that's
Yeah, I
another.
know. I'd find that very
Very
motivating.
motivating. I do. I have come to believe though that I don't think that much in the way of economic incentives can actually work. I think there's some kind of like cultural, spiritual point where society becomes it just doesn't want children anymore, and all this generous like Nordic. I mean, I think you've written about this. All these kind of Nordic systems of they get things up to like 1.5, and that's about it. And it's still nothing. As you said before, is that Israel is an exception, and they've just got a culture which is very uh, which normalizes things. And I just think it's probably to do their uniquely tragic history, which is just not the case for anyone else. And I think Georgia got it up to like 2.2 briefly with a sort of very, very concerted campaign where the archbishop or the patriarch would baptize and become godfather to every child born. But they've since collapsed again. Or they've gone down a lot. So I just don't think there's any real answers.
I think probably the two ways out. I mean, part of what's going on in Israel, right, it's partly a strong sense of sort of group like ethnic confidence, I guess, is maybe the best way of describing it. Like people don't because of historic trauma. I think also because people are constantly reminded of mortality because of the existential threat that Israel faces, and there's this slightly perverse phenomenon where when people are reminded of mortality, they want to have more children. You can test this in labs, which is why you end up with post-war baby booms so often.
Weren't I mean traditionally wakes were supposed to be big matchmaking events. And people would get
Really?
together wakes, which kind of makes complete sense to it, isn't it? It's about like
Yeah,
replenishing the.
yeah. Well, okay, so I think there are probably two ways out of this. One is to make life much more horrible, and everyone becomes much poorer and more
Okay,
frightened
give
of
me
death and
plan
whatever,
B.
and and that will encourage childbearing. The other one is just to ride it out, and eventually the really broody people will come to kind of genetically
Right.
dominate. Um, Probably that will happen.
I mean, that seems like it should happen. Obviously, I mean, if there is some genetic component to fertility or the desire to have children, which presumably there are, because I mean,
I'm sure there must be. Yeah.
it is a common thing amongst people who are sort of anti-fertility campaigners, especially I think it's couple of high-profile individuals who have been sterilized and wants to make this a sort of a kind of popular lifestyle choice, and they talk about their parents didn't really want to have children. So I mean, I don't know how much of these families repeating themselves is the upbringing, or if it's just genetics. The idea that there are sort of genetics that influence you not to continue your genes to me seems like a bit perverse. But I mean, obviously it's a thing. But yeah, there must be a sort of demographic transition where eventually there'll be a sort of small number of Koreans and Japanese people who have 10 kids each, and they basically come to dominate the future population. But
Yeah, I think that seems very likely. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of other factors that could intercede, but I had Catherine Pakulak on the podcast recently. She's an American academic and she's mother of 8,
right,
and she's written a book about her basically doing qualitative interviews with women who have both been to university and have had 5 or more children,
right,
because those are very rare women, right?
yeah,
And the conclusion she reaches basically is it's not that any of these women have suffered lower costs from having big families. It's not like they're necessarily richer or have more family support or whatever. Like they are often having children in challenging circumstances. It's just that they really, really want to.
right.
and they're willing to suffer those costs. And overwhelmingly, I think in all but one case, they're significantly religious, sometimes very religious.
Right. I mean, that's the key factor, isn't it? I mean, which is very hard to. I mean, children having families is hard. Having children is hard. I mean, not just financially, but as they get older, they become physically less difficult because they can look after themselves. But it's more emotionally challenging, um, and it is a big strain, and I guess we just don't have, as a cultural norm, that idea that you have to sort of sacrifice a lot of your own happiness. I'm not trying to make out like I'm a saint or anything, but um, yeah, it's not easy.
It's not considered to be obvious at all that you ought to do that sort of thing for the sake of the future.
I don't know. I mean, personally, I even when I was a child, I remember thinking I always wanted children. I mean, I would have liked more, but it just wasn't really financially possible. But I just always had it in my mind I would always like to have children. And I know people who are the opposite and just didn't really want it. And um, so yeah, there has to be the sort of willingness, the desire to have it, to have children.
Yeah, and the problem with trying to sort of provide economic incentives, I mean, they probably do work a bit at the margins, and I would just personally really like to pay less tax, and I would personally really like it if the government would basically stop exploiting the parents of young children, which I think is currently pretty much what happens. Like the whole future depends on this happening, and you're just not recognised really in the tax system or anything. But the analogy that Catherine used, which I thought was interesting, was it's like asking why more people aren't running marathons, which is just like an inherently difficult thing to
Yeah,
do, and saying, oh, maybe if we just give everyone like really nice trainers, then people will start running marathons. And yeah, like
yeah.
maybe at the margins, there might be some people who try running and oh, I like it, and
I mean, obviously, I would
um,
never do that. I mean, if I really wanted to run the marathon, I would, but I'm not going to run the marathon.
right, it's just difficult. It's just difficult. And like the government can buy you trainers, but the government can't run the marathon for you. And the government won't be there at 3 a.m. when your baby's crying. And there is just like an element of challenge which can't, you just have to personally.
Yeah, that is the analogy when I think of. I mean, there's lots of studies sort of like so mothers and fathers of parents with like 5 or 6 children always they seem happier. But I want is that the same as like someone who's just run a long race and saying, "Well, I feel happy that I've done that," and but were you happy on the 21st mile? I don't think you probably were. You probably actually it was actually hell.